challenges. All right, I guess we'll get started this morning. Thank you all for coming. I want to introduce Aaron Sedivy. Aaron is a 2010 graduate of UNL in horticulture and plant science. After he left here, he went to work for the Denver Botanical Gardens in Denver, obviously. And in 2016, he came here to start the Doctor of Plant Health program. Aaron did a couple internships. His first internship was done at the Federal University of Viçosa in Brazil, and worked on a number of different things. I think bananas for one, and banana diseases. But also his last internship was locally here with Rise with City Farms, and he'll talk a little bit more about some of his thinking related to urban agriculture as he goes through the seminar today. So take it away, Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me today. Hopefully you guys are sure. Is that better? A little bit. All right. So as far as urban gardening and agriculture goes, it's pretty well known and recognized with the benefits that it has on urban communities and human health and therapeutic practices. But we'll focus today more on its impact on food security, local food security primarily, and some considerations in soil improvements and crop planting that I think are significant. So we'll discuss this in three sections. The first will be kind of laying out the state of food security and how urban agriculture can impact local food security, and move towards the social interactions that are going to occur with the increase in urban gardening. Then we'll continue with designing and modifying soils to help maximize the productivity and increase our chances of having a harvest that can help with food security. And, lastly, we'll go through a production plan framework that can help prevent issues through anticipation. So it's important, I think, to keep in mind throughout this that we should be investigating assumptions, build capacity for our understanding of complex systems, and constantly evolve with these natural social ecological systems. So food security, defined by the FAO, is when all people at all times have a physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy lifestyle. So even if you have, if you're ingesting enough calories, you could still be food insecure because you're not necessarily receiving the nutrition that you need to have a healthy and active lifestyle. So it's supported with 4 pillars: availability, access, utilization, and stability. Availability is the physical presence of the healthy food in the system. So it's like your bill, whether it's at the grocery store or market, and it can be affected primarily by supply chain. Access is your household's ability to obtain the food, whether it's from the store or not. And it's going to be dependent on your financial ability, the physical distance to the store or source of the food, and your social cultural restrictions. Utilization would be your familiarity with the available food and how to prepare it to maximize nutritional value. So we saw at the beginning of COVID pandemic, that people weren't able to buy food already prepared as often. So they had to resort to cooking from scratch. And if you don't know how to cook or how to make it edible in the first place, then your food security could be in jeopardy. Stability is when all of the other three pillars are met at all times. So you can have chronic food insecurity over long timeline, or it can be persistent where you've had significant efforts made to mitigate, but it still persists, right? And the transitory would be short-term, temporary, seasonal would be somewhere in between, which is often predictable and cyclical. So we get around that traditionally through preserving food for the winter, right? As we continue, right, through life and time, urban agriculture populations are expected to only increase. Nearly 70% of the global population is expected to live in urban setting in the next 30 years. So their sensitivity to the weather extremes is going to be dependent on timing, crop, and the production systems themselves, and how able you are to produce food and have it available. An example in wheat is that week 27, which is early July, typically we get high temperatures, right? A single high temperature can reduce the yield by 5%. In forage grass, potatoes, and onion, they're more vulnerable than wheat and maize. So if we get this kind of impact from wheat, you can expect that as these temperature extremes continue, producers are going to shift from more susceptible crops to tolerant. And in the Netherlands, they did a study where they saw a third of all of the producers that they were considering had moved from potatoes and onion production to wheat because of these impacts on yield. So we know that climate change is made worse, right, by the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we have to make sure to minimize our resource use and consumption of sequestered carbon. Urban agriculture has been shown to often be more resource intensive, or more inputs are placed in urban agricultural systems than they would in field production. And to reduce the sequestered carbon, or maintain the sequestered carbon in the soil, right? We have to protect our organic matter from being further decomposed. There's several practices that are common that can have significant impacts, negative impacts on soil or carbon sequestration in the soil. So as our global population increases and we're convincing more people to start growing their own food, or maybe it's through their own needs, I guess, social interactions are going to increase as well. It's pretty well recognized. To maintain participation and keep people involved, it's essential that there's trust within these communities, and they feel free from ridicule and judgment, primarily with their decisions to implement specific tactics. So keeping and maintaining an impartial narrative will help encourage the two-way communication required to blend these differences a little better, allow people to learn from each other and their personal backgrounds and cultural histories, which can help us build our own paradigm for practice, which is our general understanding of a topic. We, as humans, we simplify the information that we're receiving all the time so that we can wrap our brains around it, right? So it's a way to preserve our cognitive health. And it's pretty critical to constantly evolve these paradigms and the amount that we understand of the system so that we can grow and better meet the needs of all of the stakeholders within it. Characteristics that are often desired in urban soils would be black or soft black, fine texture, till deep and even. If you close your eyes and think of the perfect agricultural soil, it's okay. It's probably, it fits that description, right? So most of the population that I've ever interacted with, they know they want those characteristics, but they don't necessarily know why. So oftentimes their first step would be to replace the soil or cover it up with something that looks better. But purchasing soil, a limited resource in the first place, is not always going to get you the characteristics you want. And it's a place to unintentionally introduce problems. So first off, I suggest that you test your soil so you know the characteristics that you have to work with. You find out what your texture is, the organic matter, clay content, cation exchange capacity of the soil, pH, and essential nutrients for plant growth and health. Something that's often overlooked in soil testing or not intentionally sought after is contaminants. In urban soils, this can be a pretty significant issue. And for heavy metals, which is what we'll go through today, they don't degrade, so they persist in the soil for a really long time, and it's pretty closely related with human activity. So 23% of the urban soils in the US with homes built before 1980 are expected to have hazardous concentrations of lead, which can often be used as an indicator of other pollution. Urban gardeners have been shown to be at a high exposure risk because of the proximity they are to working with it. Things to consider would be that your site history and sources of heavy metal pollution and contaminants would be weathered paint like lead paint, treated lumber, automotive pollution, the phosphate fertilizers, sewage fertilizers, anything that had run through lead-based pipes, including water, organic and synthetic pesticides. So if there's if there had been an orchard or apple tree or some kind of fruit tree in the yard, there's a pretty good chance that there are levels of arsenic and copper and concerning things related to pest management in orchards.
You know, I knew this long ago by reading it and stuff, but it wasn't until I had a house that was wood, and I had to paint it every 5 years that I realized how much paint chips in massive quantities into the soil around the house every time you repaint the house.
Yep.
And the house back then, they didn't have moisture barriers or old ones. You'd be painting at least the south side every 4 or 5 years, off an entire house.
Right.
Just massive amounts of chips.
And how many people are really cleaning up all those chips before they paint over it? It's all ending up in the soil around the house, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, Mhm. So plants can uptake these heavy metals in a lot of ways. When they do this, they can change the oxidation state of the metal, which can potentially increase toxicity and can lower the nutritional value of the plant. So even though you're consuming the adequate volumes, you might not be receiving the nutritional value that you're expecting from it. Alternatively, from direct ingestion of the plant, you can get soil contamination from ingesting the soil particles. That's the primary source of it. So it's important to cover your soil and reduce your exposure, mostly in the top 2 centimeters. So if you're not really working in the soil, that's an important area to address. Minimize your disturbances so you don't have as much dust inhaling. Wash your produce really well before you eat it. Don't eat things directly out of the garden for a number of reasons, but this is one. Remove the skin of root vegetables and the outer leaves of the leafy vegetables. Those are the most likely to contain soil particles. If you mulch the soil well, you can reduce the splashing from rain and irrigation that will bounce up onto the underside of the leaves and help reduce the amount of soil on the produce that way. Always wash your hands after working in the soil and clean your shoes before you track it into the house, where it can expose potentially more susceptible populations like children and infants and pets, right? So some other important considerations would be how the test is actually measuring the contaminant. Is it extractable total? Is it bioavailable? What's the accessibility of it, bioaccessibility? How much influence do the other characteristics of the soil have on the availability and accumulation of the heavy metal? So suggestions for remediation would be to replace, dig up, and put new soil in, seal it with an impermeable surface, or cover the soil depending on what the use is. You can also use phytoremediation, where you plant plants in the space to intentionally pull up the contaminants and then remove them and properly dispose of them so that you can eventually over time take out the contaminant from the system. And the most important, I think, for agriculture would be reducing bioavailability of the heavy metals, right? So increase your soil organic matter, potentially add calcium phosphate or iron oxide, depending on what your characteristics are. So this is probably the image that you'd consider for a healthy soil. It's dark and black, right? And those are mostly associated with mollisols. That's the pretty well-known agriculturally productive soil. Mollus means soft, and it's typically has low aeration or high aeration if it's soft, but it can be more susceptible to compaction, right? So aeration would be important in clay soils because of their small structure. They can they'll have the pore spaces in between the structures are going to be smaller as well. So you have less oxygen flowing through the system, or gas exchange in general. So to remediate clay soils that are less likely to have adequate aeration, it's recommended to integrate highly fibrous carbon into the soil. Typically, that's through mechanical tillage, but it can be really destructive to the structure that is there and the microbial communities within the soil. So an alternative could be biotillage, where you use plants to help break up the soil and loosen it. The roots that are, as the roots grow through, they create tunnels through the particles for water infiltration, gas exchange, and other plant roots that are less able to penetrate that tough soil. It will integrate carbon over time from root exudates and sloughing of cells and all that, but also when the roots die, it's a column of organic matter available to all the microbes. You don't have to change the structure at all. It's important to use crops with soil penetrating abilities that are appropriate for the soil that you have. Not all of them will respond the way you want. So do your research and find the crops that will work best in your area for those conditions, and then gradually shift to the crops that you actually want to grow in the space. The more diverse your root architecture is and like the direction of the root growth is going to have a greater impact on those improvements you want to see. Oh. So the black soil is indicative of high organic matter, and for carbon added to the soil through our amendments, you get 3 to 8% of that ends up being sequestered in the soil as biomass, which would be the living organisms within the soil. 84% of all plants have mycorrhizal associations with fungi, which help increase nutrient uptake and availability for the plant. They can access reserves that plants can't, and in turn, they get carbon. There are other microbes too, but that's an important one to consider. The 3 to 8% of carbon is stored or will be stored as microbial products and particulate organic matter. The active organic matter that you're adding can be sequestered if it's encapsulated in an aggregate. Otherwise, it's just going to be consumed by decomposers in the system. So the microbes, primarily bacteria, will release sticky extracellular polymeric substances, and that acts as a glue that sticks the soil particles and other aggregates together and occasionally entraps the active carbon, particulate matter, and sometimes other living microbes, which end up dying and then get retained in the soil. 10 to 30% of the stored carbon will become humus, which is what we really want. It's the complex structure that you hear about. So 20 to 40% of all the organic matter that you're adding to the soil is actually getting sequestered. So 60 to 80% is getting re-released into the atmosphere. So it's a little bit different than what most people expect when they're integrating carbon into a soil. All of the non-humus structures can be consumed whenever they're made available. So when you destroy the aggregates and the things that are protecting those sources of carbon, then they're made available to be decomposed, and most of that is going to end up back into the atmosphere. So the aggregates themselves are important in water infiltration and aeration. As aggregate sizes increase, so do the pore spaces, just like with clay soils in the opposite direction. The larger the pore size, the higher permeability and infiltration rate. As you add organic matter, you can increase your aggregation especially if there's sources of calcium and other cementing agents within the soil. The balance of pH is going to be improved through adding organic matter as well, and it can reduce the phytoavailability of the heavy metals. So you get a few bonuses from it. There is a pretty common misconception that increasing organic matter is going to improve your water holding capacity and availability to plants. It's got a pretty low impact actually on the available water within the soil. It's mostly going to be impacted by soil texture, and it will have a greater effect if the soil is coarse and sandy and has low organic matter. So the amount that you add will have a larger impact. In fine textured soils, they're typically high in clay and silt. So you see along here that you're increasing percent clay and increasing your percent silt and sand. So we're looking for silty clay for the fine texture. It's really difficult to get improvements in texture without actually changing the soil structure, the soil texture itself, adding clay and silt to the system. But what we want out of this, out of these fine textures, is that the clay particles are negatively charged. So it will modify the cation exchange capacity, and that we can change in the soil. So the CEC, cation exchange capacity, is the ability for the soil to hold on to positively charged particles, which many of the ions are important for plant health and development. So the CEC is impacted significantly by the pH in the soil, where the low pH soils have their negative charges satisfied by aluminum and hydrogen ions. So they can't hold on to the plant or the cations that we want them to keep for plant health. So by neutralizing the acidic soils using calcium and magnesium, we can increase the CEC and increase the stabilized organic matter, the humus. We can use synthetic fertilizers to get a quick response from plants, and it's a really valuable tool, but it is less beneficial to the natural systems compared to organic waste, and you have to constantly add or dispense the synthetic fertilizers. It's not a one-time thing. So deep and even soils, it makes for really nice working in within the soil. As you increase depth, the soil strength increases, which is the soil's ability to resist deformation. As the strength increases, the root growth is restricted. For the same reasons that we would use biotillage, or in biotillage, we'd use plants that are more adapted to penetrating those dense soils. When we reduce the root growth, it's going to reduce crop productivity and quality. The uniformly loose and even textured soil can make it easier to plant our crops at the appropriate depth and spacing to get even germination rates and better root penetration and faster plant development. Tillage, again, is usually what's used to loosen up a soil. And generally, you'd till the entire garden space at the beginning or end of, or both of every season. So we know that by breaking up the structure of the soil, we can end up releasing carbon reserves into the system, and most of that's going to end up being converted back into gas. And by increasing microbial activity, which is often seen after tillage, because we've made all this organic matter available again, it can end up competing with plants for nutrients. So if you do utilize tillage in this way, you'd want to make sure that you time it appropriately so that you're not compromising your own production. So ideally, we'd minimize the amount of disturbances to the soil. So we can use conservation tillage practices that would till only the area that we absolutely need to for planting and for root development and weed management. So in order for agriculture to, or local urban agriculture to impact food security in the best way, we need to grow the food ourselves. So we're reducing that distance, physical distance between us and the produce, make it available by maximizing our production, and we get to choose what we grow in urban agriculture generally. And in order to maintain stability for all of this, we need to anticipate the issues that we're going to have. And it's important to consider or remember that every single production system is unique, and only the stakeholders can really decide what is actually best for their system and to meet their needs based on their own limitations. So before planting, we need to, I guess by following this framework for developing a production plan, most of the work is going to be done before we plant, where we'd evaluate the production system and describe it, develop a production plan, and implement the plan, portions of the plan. To evaluate the production system, we need to define its purpose and what we need to see out of it. It will help us focus our efforts in production, so we're not using resources we don't necessarily need. So we need to available the resources we have at our disposal, the financial resources like our budget, the physical resources, tools and utilities, and our intellectual resources, other people, extension documents and agents. And then we need to consider all of the stakeholders within the system. We need to get their input on it to help increase buy-in, right? And make sure that their needs are actually being met. So in order to have a true admission of their needs and what they're expecting, we need to have trust built up first, right? So not always would the stakeholders be your immediate household, but it might be other members of your local community too.
How about subscriptions? The successful urban crop production I've seen, they try to get customers to subscribe, for delivery of a certain amount of their produce monthly. Mm-hmm. And it's the only model I've seen work long term for urban vegetable production.
Yeah. Yeah, when you're growing food for sale, this kind of planning is going to be even more important because you have a financial obligation to produce. So a lot of this is based off of business models and developing a business plan, and also integrated pest management practices and layouts for that. And Yeah, so like you said, having the feedback from the stakeholders is going to be really important, especially in that kind of situation. You have to know what they want in the first place, so you're not going to get people to participate and buy into your system. And describing your local environment is essential to understanding your system. It's what your soil test is for, and research on the crops that you can grow and the climate conditions of your area. And pest problems that you know are going to happen. Yeah, and doing that research for pests, you might discover that certain crops are actually restricted in production because of pest problems, which has happened in a few instances of area-wide integrated pest management. So you don't want to compromise the activities of the rest of agriculture. Developing your production plan would look like planning a production schedule for each crop and how the pest life cycle and prediction models are going to overlay onto your crop production schedule, which it's really a timeline for growing the crop. You'll want to know what time of the year you start planting it, and adding in sequential or successive planting. And the more that you can add to this system, the more complex it's going to be, the more difficult it's going to be, the more to consider, but the better it's going to end up meeting your needs and achieving your goals. In the pest management plan, you'll want to already have your pests identified from the production schedule and what you're expecting to see, but then decide how you're going to manage them and how you're going to scout for them. What stages of the life cycle do you need to look for? And then at what stages do you implement specific strategies? Decide on preventative measures that you can add, and the therapeutic practices that you'll use at some point, and what those conditions are going to be required for you to use the tactic.
When you say planning, are you talking about written documents?
Yeah,
Because I
write it down.
The pest management plan, be 50 pages long or so.
Yeah, I would suggest that this gets written down so that you can reference it and see what you've already looked at. You can find the sources for answering questions from your production system evaluation right away. You know exactly where to look to get the answers you need. You should have already vetted those before you actually need to use them and reference them to make sure that the information you're getting is accurate and reliable. Within your pest management plan specifically, and your production schedule, a visual aid is going to help considerably to help lay out the planning and the events within the production. And I personally like bullet points, so and lists. So it's nice to have a plan that, for me at least, that's laid out in that kind of format. So if this happens, then this happens, and all of these can happen from it.
Yeah, I've seen the situation where the pest management plan is handed as a big, brochure basically to the employees that are going to do the pest management. So if you're doing all the planning as the owner or the operator of the whole system, you very often have to realize the best management system is something that you have to plan and to your workers who specifically going to do the best management. And then to see how successful it is and possibly die.
Yep, absolutely. At each step of this, I do suggest that you reconsider all the previous steps that you've already made to make sure that it's all still working together. So you don't get at the end of the document and find out that you've planned all of this for a crop that you can't even grow or can't source it. So yeah, constantly reevaluate and make sure that your goals are realistic and obtainable, and that your needs are being met for your stakeholders. And it might not be someone that, or you might be the person doing all of the work and all of the labor involved in this. But it will require a lot less cognitive strain in the middle of the summer if you already know what you need to do when something else happens, and you know what to look out for and prepare for if you already know what the problems are going to be or potentially can be. So you can reduce the impact and reduce the response time needed to make a decision. And your decisions will be better for your specific situation, because you've already considered alternatives. You know what your resources are and your goals. So at some point, you're going to begin implementing the production plan. And this still would be done before the actual planting season. You want to set up a way to log your observations and activities. It's going to be quick and usable for you to keep with you in the garden. And so you're actually recording things, and has to be something that is easy for you to interpret. You don't want to walk away at the end of the system or season and realize you don't understand what you wrote down. It's not going to be much help. Constantly, or as frequently as you can, update your production plan with the activities and logs. So including your climate events like daily temperatures and precipitation events. It's going to impact the development of the plants and predicting a harvest timeline and all of that, and when you need to make modifications. And you'll want to do any site remediations that you need based on your soil analysis and the other evaluations from your production system that you've made and identified as weaknesses. Source your plant material so you can be sure that you have it when you need it, when it's time to plant. And if you can't find a specific crop that you were looking for, or a variety, then you still have time to go back and make changes before it's time to get things in the ground, which is going to throw off your entire production schedule. And then implement preventative measures like removing plant debris that has potential for harboring pests. And yeah, maybe you need to install row covers or something early on in the season to prevent problems. You have time at this point to do that, but you might not once you start getting things in the ground. So it's important to remember that natural systems are really complicated, way more complicated than we understand. So set your goals to be achievable. That's limited by your own personal experience and knowledge, and also the local environment and available resources you have. You don't want to be constantly competing with things you can't change. And if you have to, if this is all new to you, start by planning all of this out for one crop and one pest and develop it over time and through the season. And at the end of your production, make sure that you are also evaluating your plan and how it's worked to meet your goals. And if you maybe need to make changes for the next year, which you should, always, everyone, no matter how long you've been doing it, there are always things to improve on and more things to consider. So food security and urban agriculture is going to be more important in the future, and it's going to be critical to keep people involved through positive social interactions. And since soil is limited and not always in the budget to replace or mediate, I recommend that you spend some time and money on understanding the system you have at first and know what your soil characteristics are. And then to plan your crop and help to ensure that you're getting a harvest and having success in your production, establishing your plan in a format that it considers the entire system and the plants themselves, the insects and pests and diseases. And then implementing the plan appropriately is going to help increase your success and keep people encouraged to continue gardening, especially when they're new at it and unfamiliar. So constantly through time, investigate your own assumptions that you have on these social ecological systems and build your capacity for understanding them and constantly evolve with the natural system. They always change. They should, at least, if they're truly natural, and we should too. So I'd like to take a moment at this point to acknowledge Cassandra Hurst and her incredible sacrifices that she's made to make this day happen. And yeah, thank you all. All right, you have any questions?
When I look at urban systems, I also look at California.
Mm-hmm.
Which I see as more of an urban farm than a food farm. You know, I've always been astonished by Sal and now you are going through the importance of soil and organic matter and bio, improving it. And yet that is the worst soil I've ever encountered.
Right. Well, it's changed. Oh, sure. The urban soils are the worst soils Jerry's ever encountered. They're made to be that way for plant production, right? You don't want soils to move. You want strong soils that is impermeable to water and everything else. And yeah, so it gets modified for the urban use, not plants. They're not really considered very often during production. And anybody that's ever worked in after a construction of a project has definitely experienced that.
There's so much rubble buried.
Mm-hmm.
We are not physically aware of, we don't picture it in our mind that all this rubble can be several feet underneath.
Yep.
But in California, they would, plant all these suburbs so rapidly. The funny thing was the last ones, often the highest priced houses, to put on the clay areas that there was no drainage and flooding. And they couldn't even get a tree, yard tree to grow.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what the urban agriculture is often left with. And even our nurseries, south of Lincoln, they're on floodplain, solid clay, or some awful soil. Because for some odd reason, our urban centers are built on the best soil. Right. And it's only after some decades that we get to the point where we have agriculture on the edge of the urban area, and we're in the worst soils of the whole region.
Most of the urban setting that is continuing to develop is in worse soils than the rest of the area. Yeah, because it was left that way because it wasn't useful to anybody, right? So it wasn't productive, so it's abandoned and it's the last thing touched. But
Cheap soil.
yeah, cheap soil. Sure how that works. I'll do that while. Here, you wanna?
Yeah, Aaron, thanks. Good, well-organized presentation. Quick question about systems, which you talked about over and over, the importance of looking at the whole system. And somehow our lives are organized around departments and disciplines and kind of prejudices us to look at things in small pieces. To what extent do you think the One Health concept, I'm not sure how well you're double tasking here, but to what extent do you think the One Health concept is something that's accessible to people, useful as an organizing principle, a way to communicate things like soil health and how it relates to human health and environmental health and all the rest?
Yeah. What do you mean by?
What is One Health?
How do you?
Everything's related, I guess, and I would define it as agroecology, of course, but the fact that soil health is related to human health, to societal health, and to Gaia and all the rest. Is that a saleable principle, or is that too?
Jeez. How do you make money on that? I'm not sure. I'm sure someone can figure that out, how to make money. That's not usually my area of focus. And as Cassandra's probably dissatisfied with often. Yeah, I would absolutely agree that everything is related to everything else. I think it's hard to say that things aren't connected a lot of times. Like when you have, we can document, right, record that soils contaminated with heavy metals is reducing the nutritional value of the plant, even if it's not compromising the available nutrients in the soil. It's redirecting resources in the plant itself, so it can't allocate those to what it wants to, what it's intended to do. So that in turn is going to impact us and what we eat, how much we eat, and how much we have to grow and the space that's available. And then that's going to impact land use and compromise the available space in an urban setting even more, which is already polluted. So it's, yeah, everything's in a cycle and always impacted by everything else. But I don't know how to make money on that. Or encourage that thought very often, unless they're actively growing it themselves, if they're actually engaged in the system, which is why we need positive interactions within these social interactions. And to have people thinking ahead of problems and anticipating issues that they're going to have and how they're all related and working together. I think that's probably the best way we can develop that thought in other people, right? Okay. You think so? Okay. Okay. Can the recording be viewed? No? Okay. Many urban areas, mine included, have HOAs. I don't like HOAs very often. So yeah, you can't always grow whatever you want in these urban environments. And that's one of your restrictions. That's why you have to do your research on your system. It's going to be different from everybody else's. So find out what your limitations are from the HOA and other available resources you have, and what your problems can be and your obstacles, so that you can work around them and do what you need to modify things. At least what I've seen from HOAs is it's often a percentage of the yard. The front yard is has to be in grass. You can choose crops or turf grass that is more environmentally friendly and requires fewer inputs. That's going to help encourage your the other organisms in the system. And you can theoretically plant crops within that, as long as you're maintaining the appropriate percentage and you still have them at the required height. So you know you're going to have to prune things or do the extra inputs that might be required to make it happen, right? So yeah, it's going to be absolutely specific to your own situation.
And some things are hidden, and they're currently, and have occurred for a decade or two since I've been to Lincoln. And one is, you know, when you buy a house, they want to make sure the water, rainfall and stuff isn't going to flow into your basement. So,
Yeah, sorry.
currently, part of purchasing a house, the seller usually has to come in and place soil at a slope around the edge of the house so that water won't flow into basements, but flow away from the house. Well, I don't know what toxins they put in there, but they deliberately put in highly toxic substances that prevent plants from growing. And plants will not grow in those soils for a decade, at least around my house, which was just done. And also they'll leave a huge pile often of the excess soil. And they did this in the only sunny spot we had. Now, we thought that was wonderful soil for gardening. We couldn't get anything to grow in that soil. And that was the only sunny spot we had in the whole urban yard. And, you know, we don't think long-term, but if there was a need for victory gardens again, you know, despite the the homeowners associations, they don't even know about this stuff. It could really destroy a lot of urban crop production that's sitting there invisible.
Yeah, that's why it's really important to test your soil and know what you have to begin with. You don't want to put a lot of investment in a garden that can't grow anything in the first place. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's thank Aaron for his time today.